It was June of 1983, and the weather was already sweltering. Though summer hadn't yet reached its peak, it was clear the season would be brutally hot. In fact, June 15th was particularly scorching, and reports suggest that the streets were nearly deserted. But that would soon change. One building, in particular, was about to fill up fast, number 7, Via del Riccio. On the second floor of the building, the lifeless body of a 35-year-old woman had been discovered. The scene was anything but ordinary. Her body lay sprawled on the living room floor, fully clothed. On the upper half, she wore a T-shirt. Some sources described it as black and white striped, while others claimed it was red and white. On the lower half, she wore long white jeans and bright red shoes. She was heavily dressed, and the shoes, far from comfortable or suitable for lounging at home, suggested she had been preparing to go out when she died. Her body was lying on its left side, arms stretched out, and her face was covered with 2 cushions. There were no visible pieces of jewelry on her, except for a Rolex watch, frozen at an exact hour and date. The battery had died, the watch was literally stopped in time. But the scene was about to become even more chilling. The woman had suffered a total of 47 stab wounds, most of them concentrated on her chest, evidence of overwhelming rage. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows or forced doors. Nothing had been stolen, and everything in the apartment appeared untouched. All indications suggested that the woman had opened the door to her killer. The murder weapon was never recovered, but experts speculated it had been a Parmesan knife. It didn't seem very sharp. The majority of the wounds were shallow, except for 5 of them, which were between 3 and 4 centimeters deep. There had clearly been a struggle. The woman likely fell to the floor, at which point the attacker grabbed the cushions and smothered her face, continuing to stab her throughout. Eventually, she died in an agonizing and slow manner. The state of decomposition indicated that she had been dead for at least 3 days. And as the police combed through the apartment, they discovered even more disturbing details. In the bathroom, 2 chilling clues stood out. On the sink rested a pair of Ray-Ban glasses, missing 1 lens. And scrawled on the glass panel of the bathroom window were the words, "You are not alone, any." A sentence that could be translated as, "In any case, you are not alone." Based on the scene, the police were certain the attack had occurred in the afternoon or at night. She had dressed up, done her makeup, she was clearly getting ready to go out. But then the doorbell rang. She opened the door, and on the other side stood someone familiar, a friend, a relative, maybe a boyfriend. She let them in. There was trust. But once inside, that person attacked her. This had to be a noisy crime. A struggle. A fight. She defended herself. There must have been sounds. Someone had to hear something. Officers canvassed the building, going door to door. But shockingly, not a single neighbor reported hearing anything. No shouting. No unusual noises. Not even a raised voice. Absolute silence. The investigators were baffled, so they shifted focus. Who was this woman? What they discovered was astonishing. The victim was a public figure, Francesca Kalinobi, born on January 28, 1948, in Parma, Italy. She was 35 at the time of her death, but had already achieved more than most people twice her age. Francesca enjoyed international acclaim in the world of art. She was an art critic, a researcher at the University of Bologna, and a renowned curator. Her academic and professional interests revolved around avant-garde history and the interaction between multiple art forms: painting, theater, sculpture, music, and comics. But her influence extended far beyond Italy. Francesca had traveled the world, immersing herself in art in all its forms. During her trips to New York, she became involved with New Wave and Lower East Side artists. She collaborated with icons like Anna Magnuson, Kenny Scharf, and Keith Haring. In 1981, she fell in love with the street fashion and graffiti of the South Bronx. Her passion for art was so intense that she quickly became a talent scout, both in the US and in Italy. And if that weren't enough, at the University of Bologna she was not only a researcher, she was also a beloved professor in the Dams program, the degree in arts, music, and entertainment. Her classes were always packed. Why? Because her teaching style was unlike anything her students had seen before. She was passionate. Innovative, open, she encouraged discussion, participation, and critical thinking. She made her students think for themselves. According to her contemporaries, Francesca was extraordinary. Her personality, charisma, passion, and love for art earned her the nickname, the Muse of Dams. But back then, Dams had two faces. It was said to be an electrifying place, but also deeply chaotic. A space where creativity and destruction often walked hand in hand. Italy in the 1970s and early 80s was marked by what became known as the Anni di Piombo, the Years of Lead, a time of radical political unrest, with clashes between far-right and far-left groups, anarchists, feminist collectives, student unions, and, of course, the police. Dams was, in many ways, an oasis. A sanctuary for experimental art, conceptual performances, happenings. A space of free thought and expression. Political ideologies, alternative lifestyles, and the very concept of art were all up for debate. From the outside, it might have looked like a bohemian paradise, open, creative, progressive. But beneath the surface, there were ego battles, rivalries, and all kinds of conflicts. And that wasn't all. The police soon uncovered something even more chilling. Dams had been the setting of another, earlier crime. One that remains unsolved to this day. Angelo Fabbri was a young man with extraordinary potential. In 1982, he was just 26 years old, and no ordinary student. He was about to graduate in communication studies under the guidance of Umberto Eco himself, and was, in fact, considered Eco's most brilliant protégé. But one day, without any warning, Angelo vanished without a trace. On December 30, 1982, his lifeless body was found at the edge of a ravine. He had been stabbed 12 times. But that wasn't the crime scene, there was almost no blood. He had been murdered somewhere else, his body transported and abandoned there. An investigation followed. There were suspects, but the case was never solved. Angelo Fabbri had been. He was a brilliant and promising student, well known as one of Umberto Eco's pupils. On the other hand, Francesca Kalinobi was the celebrated Muse of Dams, a remarkable woman with international acclaim. However, it seemed the two did not know each other, and so the police did not initially link the murders. Instead, they focused on understanding Francesca, how she thought, how she moved, and who she interacted with. The key to everything appeared to be the writing on the bathroom window, "You're not alone anyway." At first glance, the phrase seems like a message of comfort, but in the context of the New York art scene of that era, it carried a very different, vulgar connotation. Essentially, "I screwed you." This raised the possibility that the writing had been left by her killer. Francesca, by all accounts, led a busy and demanding life. Her schedule was packed with work, meetings, and exhibitions. Outwardly, she projected confidence, charisma, and authority. She had a commanding presence. But behind closed doors, she was someone quite different. She often felt insecure, unsure of herself, and frequently sought reassurance from close friends and colleagues, asking whether they thought she was on the right path, whether a particular idea or project was a good one. One consistent observation from those who knew her: Francesca would never open the door to a stranger. If someone rang her bell, she would first check the window to see who it was. She had to be sure before letting anyone in. She only opened the door to people she trusted, friends, family, or perhaps a lover. That means her killer was someone she knew and trusted. She was killed 3 days before her body was discovered, and with that, the police began reconstructing the timeline. On Saturday, June 11, 1983, Francesca inaugurated 2 art exhibitions, both of which were a resounding success. Packed with attendees. That night, to celebrate, she went out partying. Witnesses recalled her as radiant, dancing and enjoying the evening with friends. She returned home at dawn and, reportedly, went straight to bed. But by midday the following day, Sunday, June 12, her phone began to ring. The first call that day came from her sister. Francesca answered, sounding cheerful and upbeat, tired, but clearly in good spirits. At 3:30 p.m., a friend from Parma phoned. He found her somewhat tense. She seemed unwilling to talk. Somewhat uncomfortable, but he assumed she was simply exhausted. Around 5:30 p.m., one of her students called with a question. They spoke briefly. The conversation was calm, uneventful. Everything seemed perfectly normal. But what the student didn't know was that he would be the last person to ever hear her voice. After that, there was only silence. At 7:55 p.m., a friend called, but Francesca didn't answer. She tried again at 8:05, then again a few minutes later. That same evening, at 8 p.m., Francesca had an appointment, but she never showed up. With this, the police were able to estimate her time of death. The forensic report stated she died between 5:30 p.m. and 11 p.m. But thanks to these phone calls, investigators were able to narrow that window significantly, placing her likely time of death between 5:30 and 8:00 p.m. Still, they needed something more, something at the crime scene that could offer a precise timestamp, something irrefutable. Then they remembered the watch on her wrist. It had stopped. The time frozen on its face was exactly 5:12 p.m. on June 14. After examining the model, they confirmed that it had a maximum power reserve of 35 hours. So they wound the hands back exactly 35 hours. That brought them to 6:12 p.m. on June 12. According to investigators, this was the time Francesca had last wound her watch. This detail became crucial. What was she doing at that exact moment? Had she met someone? Was someone visiting her? The answer to these questions might be found in what came next, a revelation that would leave everyone stunned. Francesca Kalinobi kept a journal that, in itself, could be considered a work of art, filled with sketches, drawings, and reflections. In its pages, she documented everything: her work, her creative projects, her professional contacts, and much more. Francesca's diary contained deeply personal feelings, particularly towards one of her students, Francesco Chancila, a 24-year-old painter from Pescara. According to Francesca, Francesco was a promising artist, someone she considered her masculine self. She described an overwhelming passion for him, a fierce and untamed love. But her feelings were complicated. Her love for him was toxic. He was distant, cold, and addicted to drugs. Francesca wrote that while both of them used, he indulged far more, and it was clear that his addiction was leading him down a destructive path. The fights between them were frequent. With this knowledge, the police set out to find Francesco. They discovered he was not in Bologna, as initially believed, but in Pescara. With his parents. He had arrived in Pescara the night of the murder. In an unexpected turn, he immediately admitted that he had been with Francesca that day, together until 7:30 p.m., when he said he had left her and gone to the station. Francesco's version of events was as follows. He arrived at Francesca's house, where they spent time together, using drugs. Around 6:30 or 6:45 p.m., he called a friend from her house, asking him to get more drugs and deliver them to him in an hour. After some time passed, he left at 7:30 p.m., met his friend at the station, obtained the drugs, spoke with him, and boarded a train. However, Francesco became the last person to see Francesca alive. His timeline raised significant concerns, particularly since the watch stopped at 6:12 p.m., exactly when they were together. The forensics indicated that Francesca died sometime between 5:30 p.m. and 11:00 p.m., and at 7:55 p.m., she didn't answer her phone. This narrowed the time of death to between 5:30 p.m. and 8:00 p.m., hours during which Francesco was supposedly with her. Despite the lack of physical evidence against him, Francesco was arrested on June 21 of the same year and formally charged with the murder of Francesca Kalinobi. The trial began on January 3, 1985, and it became a media sensation for several reasons. First, the evidence against him was circumstantial. Second, Francesca was incredibly well-known, and third, in the courtroom, Francesco appeared remarkably cold, calm, and distant, as though the situation had nothing to do with him. The prosecution presented its case. The timeline didn't match. Francesco was the last person to see Francesca alive, and their relationship was toxic. By 7:30 p.m., she was likely already dead. Additionally, she had a scheduled meeting at 8:00 p.m., which could have provoked Francesco's jealousy. Perhaps drugs had made him aggressive and violent, leading to an argument, a fight, or even an unprovoked outburst. Regardless, the prosecution argued that he was guilty and should pay for his actions. However, the defense presented strong counter-arguments. There was no physical evidence linking Francesco to the murder. First, the watch couldn't be used as evidence. Its time of winding didn't mean anything, and moreover, the chain of custody had been compromised. The police had arrived at the scene, took the body, and within hours, handed the watch over to the family. It was only later, after the watch was reclaimed and investigated, that it became a potential source of manipulation, thus rendering the evidence inadmissible. Furthermore, the exact time of death remained unclear, as the coroner had changed his assessment multiple times, and the body's decomposition made it difficult to pinpoint. It was even possible that Francesca had died after Francesco had left. Third, handwriting tests on the message found in the bathroom showed that the writing didn't match either Francesca's or Francesco's handwriting. It was ultimately revealed that the message had been written days earlier. As a joke, the writer was their friend, Humberto Postal, who had visited Francesca's house and during a light-hearted moment, had written it without any ill intentions. He had not been at the crime scene. Finally, there was compelling evidence in Francesco's favor. When he left Francesca's house at 7:30 p.m., he had no bloodstains on him, nor did he have any injuries. The nature of the attack suggested brutal violence. There would have been blood, and he would likely have sustained wounds. The weapon might have slipped from his grasp during a struggle, but his body showed no signs of injury to his hands, face, or neck. The friend who had met Francesco at the station noted that he appeared as normal and composed as ever. The trial concluded with an acquittal, leaving the courtroom in shock and divided. On one side, there were those who believed in Francesco's innocence, while on the other, a majority was convinced of his guilt. The disbelief was palpable, and in the end, an appeal was filed. The trial took place the following year, on December 3, 1986, and again relied on circumstantial evidence. There was no confession, no witnesses. The prosecution seemed determined to convict Francesco at all costs, hoping to close the case as quickly as possible. On the day the final verdict was to be delivered, Francesco was nowhere to be found, and thus, he could not hear the sentence. This time, he was sentenced to 15 years in prison. The sentence was confirmed in 1988, but it was later reduced to 10 years. Francesco, however, was missing. What actually happened was that he had fled to Brazil, knowing that he would be imprisoned. In Brazil, he sought to start over, first as an artist, then as a photographer. In São Paulo, he held an exhibition, and a group of Italians immediately recognized his work. They loudly proclaimed that it resembled the style of Chancila's, and terrified, he fled the scene. He left the exhibition and hid, eventually traveling to Spain. In Spain, he obtained a fake passport under the name Gian Pietro Contantini. In Madrid, he became an Italian teacher. However, in 1997, his life came to an end when the police found him. He was arrested, sent back to Italy, and there, he was sentenced to 10 years in prison. He was released in 2006 and has since repeatedly claimed his innocence, insisting that he never killed Francesca or harmed her, and that the person who did is still free. Many people still believe he is innocent, claiming that there are two hypotheses the police failed to consider. The first is found in Francesca Kalinobi's own diary, in which she not only wrote about Francesco but also about many other people. She spoke of artists, critics, acquaintances, and friends. She recounted her experiences, including one about a drug lord she supposedly met during a trip to. This woman wrote passionately, poetically, and artistically. Often, according to some, she exaggerated in her writings, creating genuine works of art. The so-called drug lord might not have been one, but to her, there was something about him that made her believe he was. People focused on this detail, as well as the circles she moved in, artistic and revolutionary circles, filled with diverse, sometimes opposing ideas. These were circles where people used drugs, and perhaps, in these environments, Francesca saw something she shouldn't have. Maybe she upset someone influential, and that person took her life. The second hypothesis is related to the so-called Dams monster. At that time, many others died under similar circumstances. In the context of Dams, there was Angelo Fabri, who died before Francesca, and two more girls who died after her. These girls' deaths were unrelated to Angelo and Francesca, though. One was strangled and the other shot. One case was solved, but the other remains unsolved. However, the modus operandi in both the cases of Angelo and Francesca could have been strikingly similar. Angelo was stabbed 12 times, and Francesca 47. Both cases remain poorly resolved. Angelo's case is completely unsolved. And Francesca's is considered by many to have been closed improperly. Perhaps both crimes were the work of the same person. What do you think of this case? Do you believe Chancila was truly guilty? Well, folks, that's all for today's video. I hope you found this case as interesting as I did, because it certainly was for me, and I hope I explained it properly, given that it's such a twisted case with many complexities. There are so many little details, so many small corners, and I'd really like to know what you think about the Chancila case. Do you think he did it? Or was it someone else, like the Dams monster? I'd love to hear your perspective because, honestly, I don't know what to think. And no, I'm not kidding. It's not just for you to interact with the video and say, if you like the content and want more like this, interact in the comments. That would really make me happy. So, see you in the next video.